Hey guys, welcome back. And this is the new episode of Co-Travel Podcast with Bob Piercy. And I'm happy today to say that Ted Gray from Sci-Can is the guest. Ted, thanks for doing this today.
Thanks, Bob. Happy to be here. Looking forward to this. We'll see where we end up.
We'll see where we go from here. And hey, we're actually recording this on a Friday. We're recording this on the Friday before the big, Alberta going into the next lockdown and shutdown. And so, hey, let's make this as much fun as we can make it with this doom pending on the horizon.
Exactly.
Ted, the reason I wanted to have you on today is you have an interesting role. You're a Sci-Can. Obviously, you're selling a lot of cleaning and sterilizing products, but you also spend a lot of time in clinics educating on infection control policies and procedures. And I wanted to talk to you on that aspect. Like, what are you seeing? Alberta had a lot of changes in terms of our infection control policy back in 2010. That's actually coincides when I got into dentistry.
Right.
We're basically 11 years since then. I just want to kind of touch base. Like, what are you seeing out in the market right now? What are the questions, concerns? And obviously, too, another question is like, how is COVID affecting and changing the infection control policies in dental practices?
Okay, sure. So I've been doing this for 28 years now. Actually, April was my 28th anniversary.
Congratulations.
I was brought into the industry because of HIV. And what happened was in the late 80s, early 90s, a dentist in Florida infected six of his female patients with HIV. And when that happened, the industry went into panic mode. And after that happened, everybody started sterilizing their handpieces and all of their instruments. So before the 90s, handpieces were sometimes sterilized once a week, whether they needed it or not, which doesn't make any sense. Why sterilize it once a week? You either sterilize it or you don't. So everybody had to increase their protocols then. Then what we saw here in Alberta was in 2007, there was an incident in Vegreville Hospital. And a supervisor walking down the hallway saw them reprocessing the colonoscopy scopes. And what he saw them do was take the colonoscopy scope, take a disinfectant wipe it off, and go, who's next? So they were caught transmitting fecal matter and human tissue from patient to patient to patient. The supervisor got very upset and said to the staff, that's obviously not how you do it. Why are you doing it that way? Their answer was, that's how Sally told us how to do it. So he said, well, who's Sally? Well, Sally was the dental nurse who trained them on how to reprocess it 5 years ago.
Wow.
So nobody had actually read the manual on proper reprocessing of the scopes. They just took Sally's word as gospel and started doing that. So he got very upset and he fired the entire hospital cleaning staff. Being unionized, they grieved it and they were all reinstated because nowhere in their contract did it state that they had to know what they were doing. So at that point, Ed Stelmach said, we're going to rewrite infection control guidelines for Alberta, and we're going to include dental practices, general physicians, tattoo parlors, nail clinics, all of them. So we all fall under one set of guidelines. Those guidelines came out in 2008, and the ADA&C interpreted them and put out their own set of rules in 2010, or not 2010, trying to take that dental speak and turn it into dental speak. So the infection prevention and control guidelines that we follow here in Alberta were published in 2010. And in 2018, there was an update sent out to every dental office in Alberta. That sort of fell by the wayside. They were going to do a complete rewrite for 2020, but of course, COVID happened, so that rewrite was put onto the back burner. We highly suspect we're going to get a new set of rules here in Alberta in 2021 or maybe 22, so maybe early next year at the latest.
Now, I remember back, again, like 2010, when I kind of came into the industry, initially there's a lot of people were running around and there's all these drafts of this, new protocol that's coming out, and people were racing to try to get, and they're making decisions based on these drafts, and people are buying stuff for concern that things were going to happen. And in the end, the actual document that came out was probably in some areas, more strict than it was drafted, but in a lot of areas where it was less restrictive and less than what the drafts were initially describing, and that caused a lot of concern.
Right.
Do we have an idea? And again, so lessons learned, like let's not rush into anything until you get the new documents in the
Yeah.
final version. So again, later 2021 or 2022. Do we have ideas as to where they're targeting or things that they're looking at for this next version?
Yeah, so in Canada, there is a committee called the Medical Device Reprocessing Committee, and it's 32 people who represent the dental industry, the medical industry, hospitals, manufacturing. All of us get together and we look at what equipment is available, what testing procedures should be done, and they try to develop protocols. And then they publish that under the Canadian Standards Association. Then the public health officials follow that as their Bible as to what the infection control guidelines should be. Then organizations like the Alberta Dental Association take those rules and try to pare them down from 500 pages down to about a manageable 110, 120 pages and convert it from medical speak to dental speak. So this committee published their latest guidelines in January of 2019. So we can see where the ADA&C is going to be making changes to the rules to match those new guidelines from that committee. Now, Sci-Can as a corporation, we do have a representative who sits on that committee. I was asked to sit on the committee, but ended up not getting on the committee because the committee meets in Toronto and it would be too expensive for me to constantly be flying back and forth. So somebody else from Sci-Can, actually one of our engineers, sits on that committee and I have direct access to that gentleman. So I get a little bit of a prequel to what they're working on. I also have submitted stuff to him, to the committee, to try and get some of the rules changed. For example, we're now using these class 5 or type 5 chemical indicators. We've been using them for years in invasive, and as of January of 2019, we're required to put one in every load. Those type 5s are every bit as accurate as the biological indicator tests that we're doing. So I have petitioned the committee to reduce the number of biological indicator tests we have to do and just use the type 5s, because if they're just as accurate and less expensive, why not use those? So that's one of the things on their agenda that they're looking at. I'm hoping it's going to go our way and we'll reduce the number of BIs that we have to do and reduce some of those testing costs.
And we've talked about this in just you and I as well, like, in regards to like biological indicators too, and Boy-Dick tests. A lot of the machines have these things already, kind of this testing feature built in, and a paper lumen test is kind of redundant.
Well, yeah, there are so many redundancies built into the sterilizers that have been manufactured in the last 10 years that it is almost impossible for those to complete a cycle and not sterilize. There are, redundant temperature testers, redundant pressure testers, things measuring the exhaust, things measuring the amount of water coming in, that if the sterilizer completes a cycle, there is almost zero chance that those instruments are not sterile.
Now, in regards to, we live in Alberta and this is the world that we operate in, and obviously our clients need to adhere to these rules. After Alberta introduced the updated infection control policy in 2010, other provinces started to follow suit. Saskatchewan, British Columbia, and it worked its way across the country, as I remember and recall. Mm-hmm. Now, my kind of cynical take on some form of governments is that whatever you did, I'm going to do more, because that way I look better because I've done more. Now, that didn't really happen, did it?
Well, kind of it did, because our infection control policy is actually based on what's called the PIDAC document that came out in Ontario first. So Ontario had the SARS outbreak, the original SARS outbreak. So after that, the Ontario Dental Association increased their rules based on the new medical rules that came out there. Then Alberta piggybacked on that, and if you read the Alberta infection control policy, you'll see where it references the PIDAC document all the time. Then Saskatchewan came out with their new rules in 2019, where they took our rules, the PIDAC document, and went another step above that. Quebec is coming out with a whole bunch of new guidelines there, so they're going to step above us again. So where we thought we were the leading edge, we're now falling behind. The stragglers are really British Columbia. They came out with a new document about 5, 6 years ago. And basically their document, paragraph 1 says, as a dental healthcare professional, you will follow these rules to the letter. But paragraph 2 says, you're a private business owner, and if you choose not to, you don't have to. The Alberta Infection Prevention and Control Manual is approximately 115 pages long. The BC Infection and Control Manual is one 11 by 14 sheet of paper that they laminated one side and sent to every dental office in BC. So in Alberta and Saskatchewan, it's nice because everything's pretty much black and white. You will do this, you won't do that. The BC rules leave a lot of gray area for interpretation. And we see very strange interpretations of what's written in the guidelines out there. So I can see where BC is going to have to step up the game and just clarify everything. And what I find in dental practices is everybody hates change. Mm-hmm. But once they make the change and realize it wasn't that big a deal, they adopt it and they appreciate it. BC, what they want, or what most dental offices want, is they just want it in black and white. Just tell us what we're supposed to do, and that's what we'll do. When you leave it wishy-washy or gray areas, there's too much confusion.
So what you're seeing in BC is doctors and offices are actually asking for more clarification.
Absolutely, yeah. You know, they look at what they're reading and go, this doesn't make sense. And that's what I like to see is it should all be written in plain English. Mm-hmm. So one of the questions I get asked all the time when I go into dental offices to do infection prevention and control training is, do we have to double wrap our cassettes in Alberta? The way it's written, not in the ADA and C guidelines, because they don't actually specify in the guidelines whether you have to. The only place where the ADA and C specifically says you must double wrap is in the video series that they put together 10 years ago. So they put out 3 videos on how to reprocess instruments. And in the second video, 9 minutes in, the moderator says very clearly, cassettes must be double wrapped. That's the only place that you can find it. When you look at the CSA document, the Medical Device Reprocessing Guide, what it states in there very clearly for everybody to read is, in the absence of a third-party clinical study stating that single barrier wrap is sufficient, you may wrap sequentially or non-sequentially. Not plain English that everybody can understand.
It sounds like you just said that verbatim, word for word, like you've said this 100 times earlier.
1,000,000,000 times. So I've checked with the public health officials, I've checked with the people on the committee, and what they mean is, if the wrap manufacturer comes to you and says, we have tested our wrap, and here's a clinical study proving that one barrier of our wrap is sufficient, then you're good to go. So companies like Hetty just recently came out with a 1-layer wrap that's got a clinical study. Hugh Freedy now has one. There's some other ones hitting the market, but they're slightly more expensive. So what the other thing the guideline says is, in the absence of that third-party clinical study, you can wrap sequentially, which means wrap it once and then wrap it again, or non-sequentially, which means taking 2 pieces at the same time and wrapping it with those 2 pieces. So in Alberta and now in Saskatchewan and coming up in Quebec, all cassettes must be double wrapped unless specifically specified by the manufacturer of the wrap. The only other exception to the rule is the Kimberly-Clark wrap, but when you look at it, it's 2 pieces welded together at the seams.
Right, and I was thinking of that one actually as you're talking. And I just want to say real quick, like, you know, like this is the dental industry. Like, you know, we work with doctors and offices and assistants and hygienists all the time, and you know, like these people are in the healthcare industry. They're there to care. They do care about their patients, and they do want to keep their patients safe. And we might laugh at certain things, and in this whole conversation, and by all means, like this is a serious topic, and we're not belittling, or I'm not belittling it. Neither of us are, like what they're doing or like the intent of these offices. Like they want to do right by their patients, but then, you know, I think as businesses, they find themselves walking a line where what is enough, what is too much, what is like redundant, what is complete overkill, and not making this, like how much of these changes are actually making dentistry safer for their patients, because dentistry is already an incredibly safe thing for patients to attend.
Right, and the problem we run into is not the policies and the procedures. What we run into is complacency. The one thing about dental procedures is they're very routine. We have the patient, we seat the patient, we open up our pouches, we treat the patient leaves the operatory, we gather up the garbage, we wipe the surfaces, go to the reprocessing, reprocess instruments, go back, repeat, repeat, repeat. And a lot of people end up on autopilot, so they stop thinking about what they're doing, and that's where we see accidents happen. The other thing is, in my experience in 28 years, is the vast majority of dental practices are doing a very, very good job. There's a small percentage that's doing an okay job, and there's a very, very tiny percentage that is not doing an okay job. I can tell you, I have been in dental practices where there isn't even a sterilizer, that the sterilizer broke down and they didn't bother to get it repaired or replaced. I left an office this morning that they have an instrument washer. And when I watched the instrument washer, it wasn't functioning at all. The wash arms weren't spinning. So none of the instruments were getting properly washed. And nobody had noticed, because it's such a busy practice, they've got to keep the flow moving. They started to notice some debris on the instruments, which meant they had to do a little bit more hand scrubbing, but they never thought, well, why is it there? They were just so rushed, they just kept putting it through. And unfortunately, whoever was maintaining their washer wasn't doing it correctly. So that happens. And in the small percentage of offices that just don't care, unfortunately, if something happens in one of those practices, we're all going to get painted with the same brush. Mm-hmm. So if you look at Guelph, Ontario in 2017, a 16-year-old male patient developed hepatitis C. His only risk factor was a treatment at a dental practice. So public health went to that dental practice, found out that that practice was not following proper protocols, so closed that practice down. Published their name in the news agencies picked it up, and public health was inundated with phone calls from the general population stating, I'm not sure my hygienist changed her gloves. The instruments they used didn't come out of a pouch. They were just sitting on the counter. And public health went out and started auditing dental offices, and they closed down on the spot 70% of the dental offices for non-compliance.
70%.
70%. Now, remember, they're going to 70% of the offices where somebody complained that they saw something wrong. If they'd gone out and looked at the vast majority of practices, they wouldn't have found that many problems. But they were auditing, let's call it the worst of the worst.
Right.
So they were closing those ones down. The interesting thing is, after that incident in Ontario, my company and my competitor who manufactures sterilizers, we sold 500 sterilizers in one day in Ontario. Between July and January, we sold 3,000 sterilizers into an area of just under 7,000 dental practices, which means when this happened, a lot of offices went back and looked at their reprocessing systems and said, you know what, we're overloading the sterilizer, we're rushing stuff, we need to relook at this and set up a better policy and procedure.
And it's a tough part of running a business, because it's fun to talk about CBCT or CAD/CAM or lasers, or it's fun to talk about that part of dentistry. And it's like mechanical rooms. Like, no one likes spending money fixing an old compressor, because no one sees it as fun or sexy. But again, it's a vital part of the practice. And same thing with reprocessing. And I know of practices too that offices develop and they open, and everyone has the best of intentions, and that practice does really, really well. And all of a sudden that practice starts growing and expanding. And it's fun to expand operatories, but the thought of expanding sterilization centers for reprocessing, again, that's not seen as a moneymaker. It's not seen as offering better care or more care.
It's obviously seen as a loss of money. It costs money to reprocess instruments. It costs money to pay staff to reprocess those instruments. What a lot of offices have to look at is they don't do a business analysis on it, right? If you look at a 4-operatory clinic, if you add up the number of hours that the assistant and the hygienist are spending in reprocessing, scrubbing instruments and reprocessing things manually, that's a huge cost. In fact, it's actually less expensive to hire a full-time instrument processor, somebody to just scrub the instruments, than to have those people in there. If you do the business analysis, you can actually free them up to be doing things that produce revenue rather than having them scrubbing instruments.
Mm-hmm.
if you think about your house, when was the last time you were in a house that didn't have a dishwasher?
It's been a long time.
Is time consuming by hand. It's a chore that nobody wants to do. And a lot of times it's not done very well. So we buy dishwashers so that it's done effectively every single time.
Mm-hmm.
But then we have dental offices that hire dental staff, and we expect them to wash the instruments by hand and use an ultrasonic. If they looked at an instrument processor, an instrument washer, it frees up the staff to be doing other things that are producing revenue, and it automates the system so every single instrument is treated exactly the same way every single time, and it's actually cost effective. If you add it up, you do the business analysis, over time, it's going to save you money. But unfortunately, a lot of practices just look at it, well, there's a huge initial investment there, it's going to cost me money. No, you got to look at the long term, you got to look at freeing up people to do revenue producing procedures. Mm-hmm. The more we can automate reprocessing, the better. Every instrument treated exactly the same way every time. We take that human factor out of it.
No, absolutely. And going back just a little bit, you're talking about the start of this whole reprocessing journey. I remember seeing a video, it probably was made back in the 70s or 80s. It was like, if saliva were red.
Yeah.
And it went through, if you haven't looked at it, Google it, find it on YouTube. But basically, it shows a dental procedure back in the day. And I think the doctor in the procedure wasn't even wearing gloves. It goes back that far. And what they did is they had a patient and they had red dye put in the patient's mouth. And so then they had someone walk in, hand the doctor a paper chart, back in days of paper charts. And they had
telephones and
and they showed where the spatter went.
Right.
And but again, we don't notice that because saliva is clear. And then you could fast forward and apply that same video in regards to COVID and aerosols and microbubbles and stuff, and just kind of seeing how things spread. Because again, it's clear, it's invisible. But just you said that earlier, and it sparked the memory of this video, If Saliva Were Red. And
so it's a very interesting video. What they actually did in that video is they took 1 milliliter of red dye number 7 and put it in the patient's mouth and did the procedure. Now it's just 1 milliliter. Then they used red dye number 7 because the particle size is almost exactly the same size as a red blood cell.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And then they showed just how far that 1 milliliter goes. And you see it splattering over the doctor, splattering over the assistant, all over the paper chart, and the assistant's touching her ear, and her ear is covered in this stuff. And just to give you an indication of how far those aerosols go. With COVID, there's a lot of discussion about the aerosolization of the blood and saliva from the patient's mouth. And we get hung up on the difference between aerosols and droplets. So when you're doing a dental procedure and you're seeing that debris coming out of the patient's mouth, those are droplets. And they're large particles, and they're going to settle out very quickly. The aerosols are microscopic, and they're almost impossible to see, and they can remain airborne for quite a bit of time. And with a Cavitron, they're going to travel 12 feet in all directions, and with a high speed, they're going to travel 10 feet in all directions. So they're going to cover everything. And as dental healthcare professionals, you're sitting 18 inches from the oral cavity, which means your entire face, your hair, your neck, your chest is being completely saturated in these micro droplets. And we have to think about that when we're, going up, leaving the office in our uniforms, going to the grocery store, grabbing that apple, rubbing it up against the last 20 patients and putting it back down. We have to worry about this cross-contamination. So when COVID happened 14 months ago, in Alberta, we took the position that as dental healthcare professionals, we're used to dealing with aerosols. We don't need to mitigate our systems at all. In Saskatchewan, they looked at the scientific data that was available at that time that showed COVID was a very small particle, could remain airborne for quite some time. And as a small particle, if you breathed it in, it tended to travel down deeper into your lungs and become rooted in your lungs. So in Saskatchewan, they made the decision that all the operatories had to be sectioned off into individual rooms that had doors that you could open and close, that if you did a procedure in that room, you couldn't go back into that room for 3 hours to allow those aerosols to settle. Then you would go in and wipe the surfaces, or you could add in air filtration systems or additional suction systems so you can turn those operatories over faster. In the Alberta COVID protocols, what it states is you don't need to do any of that stuff. It's not necessary. But literally in the next paragraph after that, it states, you really should look at doing that stuff. And a lot of offices did bring it in. And what we have seen, a clinical study that's going to be released by the Canadian Armed Forces that shows if you do add in those air filtration systems and the additional suction systems, that the rate of aerosolization in the operatory is insignificant. It's almost unmeasurable. So that can have a patient impact. And the reality is, when patients see those air filtration systems in the reception room or in the operatories, it gives them a feeling of well-being, like they are being more looked after.
Yeah, and I've seen studies done too for, again, high volume evacuation systems that are claiming to, and again, it's a study that I'm trusting, but they're claiming to, it will capture, if used properly, like high 90% of aerosols being generated. And again, a dental office, again, going back to what was implemented in 2010 here in Alberta, like again, they were already safe places dealing with, considering all patients to be potentially highly infectious, and so there's a barrier of protection already in place. So again, I don't think the need for
the reality is, if we're wearing our PPE correctly,
Yep.
we have nothing to worry about. Now, there is some studies that have been done in the United States by the US Department of Labor, and they looked at all the different jobs in the United States and came up with their list of their top 100 most unhealthy jobs. Number 1, dental hygienist. Number 2, dental assistant. Number 4 was dentist, as the most unhealthy jobs. And part of that is, as dental healthcare professionals, the assistants and the doctors and the hygienists tend to sit at very odd angles to try and get at those weird furcations and that sort of stuff. So they have a lot of back problems. But also, dental healthcare professionals tended to get more colds and flus than the general public, or even kindergarten teachers. And from my experience, the reason for that was, in a lot of offices I go into, I'd say it's at least 30% before COVID, the dental hygienist and the staff is wearing the mask below their nose, because it was so hot to breathe through, it was more comfortable to pull it down below their nose. So that aerosol that was coming out of the patient's mouth, if it had anything infectious in it, they were breathing it in. With COVID, it re-kicked in our thinking, and everybody's wearing the mask correctly now. We're wearing level 3 masks, so we're getting much more better filtration. So we're not seeing that infectious thing happening in dental practices right now. And what's really interesting is, since COVID happened, influenza has disappeared around the world. There aren't flus anywhere in the world right now.
I've heard that, and I've heard, but I was actually listening to another podcast. I was listening to a Joe Rogan podcast, and they actually, on the podcast, they actually Googled it apparently. And apparently in the US in 2020, there was still over 20,000 deaths due to influenza in the US. And now, please check my stats, double check me. But that's what I heard there. So it wasn't zero, but it definitely was a lot less. And the possibility that, the general public, we're wearing more masks, we're more concerned, everyone's got hand sanitizer in their car, and obviously, whether it's dental offices or medical facilities, everyone's taking heightened PPE concerns. So
in 2018 and 2019, we had lots and lots and lots of norovirus cases in Alberta. Now we've got none. My concern is that dental offices have become so focused on COVID, they're forgetting about all the other infectious things that are out there that we need to be concerned about. In the world right now, 2.3 billion people, that's billion with a B, are infected with hepatitis. Of that, 80% of people infected with hepatitis don't know they have it. So that's an astronomical rate. Now, in Alberta, those hepatitis rates are much lower, but you go to other countries, it's much higher. And millions of people every year die from hepatitis. In Edmonton right now, current stats are there are 800 active cases of syphilis. Now, syphilis can be spread by oral fluids. And as dental healthcare professionals, we have to be concerned about that. So we have to make sure we're following all of those protocols. So we still have to think about all the other things that are out there. The hepatitis, the herpes, the syphilis, the TB, all the other potential agents. So we have to make sure that we're on our game. COVID is an envelope virus. It is one of the easiest viruses to deactivate. Hand soap, laundry soap, disinfectants, they're all highly effective against COVID. So, I'm not concerned about, getting COVID if I'm wearing my mask correctly. I'm not concerned about touching a surface than if I'm doing my hand hygiene correctly. I'm more concerned about things like hepatitis. Hepatitis is a very hardy virus. There are some clinical studies that state that hepatitis can remain infectious on a surface for up to 6 weeks. COVID, we have no idea. It's very quick that it dies or becomes inactive.
And so, but again, these rules that we're following in the dental offices, if we protect ourselves properly against one, we should be protected against most, if not all, correct?
Exactly. The way the protocols were written, the guidelines were written, were for the most infectious things out there. So those protocols were written for HIV, for hepatitis, for TB. So there's no need to do anything extra as long as we are following those guidelines. Unfortunately, I go into a lot of offices and they'll tell me, yeah, we have a known hepatitis patient, so we double glove, we scrub everything extra, then we run it through the instrument processor, and there's no requirement to do that, and it's not necessary. You're just adding to your costs. And technically, you have to treat every single patient exactly the same way.
I was going to say, like, that's actually technically discrimination, is it not? Because,
yes,
yeah, so if that patient found out that you were doing that because of their medical condition, they would have,
they would have legal recourse if they chose to.
Right. Now, I guess, like, obviously no names, and you deal a lot with, like, a lot of confidentiality in regards to what you're doing, but what do you see out there? What are some simple mistakes people are making? What are some of the, the war stories that you've come across that, people we can honestly learn from, not laugh at, but learn from? And, like, and yeah, just like, what have you seen out there?
Okay, so I'll give you my ultimate horror story. I was called by a hygienist to go to a dental clinic. She called me up. She said, Ted, could you come by? I know you do infection control training, and I don't think we're doing things right in my office. And I said, you're in luck. I happen to be 20 minutes away. I can come right now. So that doesn't give them time to change what they're doing. So I go to this office, and it was an exceedingly old office. Now, they had what was called a Cox Steri Center. Cox stopped making dental equipment 40 years ago. So it gives you an indication of how old the equipment was in this office. And when I looked inside this Cox Steri Center, opened the cupboards, it was hairy with black mold inside.
Oh, wow.
So that was problem number one. So then I asked them what their protocol was, and at the end of the procedure, they would bring the contaminated instruments back and they would throw them into the ultrasonic. Now, Sci-Can, the company I work for, is also Coltine. We manufacture ultrasonics, and I can tell you that the instructions for every ultrasonic ever manufactured tells you to pre-scrub the instruments before they go in the ultrasonic. Ultrasonics are designed to remove the microscopic debris, not the chunks. So she's thrown these instruments in the ultrasonic, and I look inside, and I can see debris all over the instruments. She turns it on. The ultrasonic starts making noise, but there's no ripples in the solution. So I put my finger in there, and there's no vibration. I do a foil test, and it's not doing anything. It's making noise, but it's not functioning at all. So at the end of the ultrasonic procedure, they gathered up the instruments and put them directly into a pouch. They weren't rinsing off the ultrasonic solution. So basically, they were making bacterial soup, soaking the instruments in this bacterial soup and putting them into a pouch. Then taking them directly to the operatory because their sterilizer broke down 2 years ago and the doctor wouldn't replace it. So that was my ultimate horror story. That one just, in 28 years, that one just shocked me, to no end. And that's the only time I've had to intervene. But generally what you see, the general mistakes are rushing stuff through reprocessing. I was in an office last week, brand new office, just opening up, and I literally watched the staff come in carrying the contaminated instruments, put them on the countertop with their dirty gloves, then go to the sterilizer, open the door, and start unloading with those same dirty gloves. I watched them drop stuff on the floor and pick it up and put it into a pouch. Just not thinking about what they're doing because they're feeling very rushed because it's a new clinic. We got to get things going. We've been delayed a month for opening. We got patients waiting. We got to rush. And that's the big mistake is rushing and not thinking about what you're doing. with public health, really there's four big things with public health that really are the main things they're looking for. Number one is your sterilizer testing and record keeping. If you're not doing your spore tests correctly, if you don't have the proper records for that sterilization, that is a big one for public health. And in the past, we've seen quite a few offices shut down for that one reason only. The next biggie with public health is expired product. You cannot have any expired product in your office unless it's in a cupboard that's labeled not for patient use. So, and with public health, there's no quarter. If it says it expired on April 31st, May 1st, you cannot use it. Okay, you can't, well, what's the lead time? And I get that all the time. Well, I know it's expired, but we're only 3 months past the expiry date. It's not a best before date, it's an expiry date. You can't use it after the expiry date. Example of that, I did an audit in an office 6 months ago, and when I checked their anesthetic in the operatory, the anesthetic they were using had expired 3 years ago, but they were still using it because nobody spotted the expiry date. When I pointed it out to them, they were quite excited because they hadn't been able to figure out why their patients didn't seem to be freezing. They were using a lot more anesthetic to get the same result. So it's important that we watch those things. There's a reason why there's an expiry date. Now, I understand that salad dressing in your fridge doesn't go bad at that date, that's a best before date, but expiry dates, we have to follow those. So it's important that we don't overstock offices. Obviously, that office that had that expired anesthetic, there was a great deal on anesthetic, so he bought enough to last 5 years. So we have to watch for that. So that's number two. Number three is no reuse of single-use disposable product. And the most common one that I see dentists doing is the little carpules of composite, the ones from 3M, those little black carpules. Those are single-use disposable products. And I would say more than 50% of dental offices are multi-dosing those. The whole idea of the design of those was to make them more aseptic, to make the chance of cross-contamination much less. Now, I've been in offices where the dentist has tried to argue, well, no, I didn't express it into the patient's mouth. I expressed it onto a pad and I put it in manually. Doesn't matter. Right on the vial, on the bottle that it comes in, it is marked as a single-use disposable product.
And even if you were doing that, if you were being inspected by an inspector, you couldn't guarantee to the inspector that that's exactly what you're doing. And they need to go based on what's the instructions for use from the
manufacturer's instructions for use, which means once you take that cap off and put it in the gun, it is used and you cannot reuse it.
Right.
That question comes up with endo files and whatnot as well. I have a lot of offices that they'll do an open and drain for an endo procedure and then put the files in a pouch. And when the patient comes back to finish the procedure, they'll take that pouch of instruments out and reuse them on that same patient. And under all our guidelines in Alberta, you can't do that. You can use an endo file in multiple canals on the same appointment, but once that appointment is finished, if that file has been in the canal, it must be disposed of. There's no reprocessing of used endo files. So I realize there's a cost factor to that, but that is built into the fee. Back in 2010, when we started throwing away the endo files, the ADA&C recommended an increase to those fees to cover that. So I understand there's a cost to doing that, but it's one of those things that we have to do.
And again, like my understanding, my assumption too is like, people that are missing areas on this in their practice, again, it's not intended neglect for the vast majority of it. It's just, it's lack of information. It's like you say, probably rushing is probably one of the largest culprits and just making a mistake.
And a lot of it is, that's the way I used to do it. So that's the way I'm going to continue to do it.
Right.
And we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
And the guidelines are always changing. And there's a reason for why they're changing is we're gathering more information. So for example, on the endo files, there are multiple clinical studies that have been done with endo files after reprocessing, putting them under electron microscopes and seeing whether or not they are actually clean. And what the clinical studies show us that in 80% of the cases, after the endo file has been reprocessed, there is still human tissue on that file. There's just no way. It's the same with diamonds and carbide burrs. In the United States, as per FDA instructions, all diamonds and all carbide burrs are single-use disposable. Because when they went to the reprocessing guides put out by the diamond manufacturers, what they found was a 100% failure rate. Every diamond they tested still had human tissue on it. Now, that adds a cost factor, but we can look at single-use disposable burrs that are much less expensive, and they don't have to be reprocessed, so we don't have that fee in there as well. So, there are ways around those situations. But it's as we learn things. Now, one of the discussions that came up in the class I gave this morning was in Saskatchewan, they have to sterilize their slow-speed motors and their electric motors between patients. The reason for that is there are now 6 clinical studies that show that debris can go into the slow-speed attachment, the Profi angle, or the high-speed attachment on an electric motor, travel through the shank into the motor. Then on the next patient, come out of the motor, go through the shaft or the shank and into the next patient. None of the clinical studies say that that human tissue is infectious, but is still human tissue from one patient getting into another. So the CDC guidelines in the United States and what we're seeing in Canada in the newer guidelines is we're going to have to start sterilizing those slow speed motors as well as our high speed hand pieces.
So that's one of the things you're expecting to see in this next version come 2021 or 2022?
Yeah, we are already seeing it in Saskatchewan, the Quebec guidelines that haven't become mandated yet, but it is in their drafts that it's coming. And CDC and Health Canada are going to mandate that the motors be autoclaved.
When you're doing one of these inspections and you come across something that's being missed in an office, there's a lot of pride by the people working in those clinics that they're doing these jobs, and I can imagine that it's pride. It hurts their pride personally. There's obviously a lot of concern. I imagine it could get quite heated and
Yeah.
how do you handle that in a practice? And how should an office handle that concern? Because everyone is, again, for the most part, trying their best, but again, stuff happens.
Yeah, and when I'm doing these audits, I have to handle that with kid gloves and not say, okay, Sally, this is entirely your fault. You have to try and bring them along with you. Now, under the Alberta ADA and C guidelines, every single dental office is supposed to have an infection prevention and control protocol officer. It's somebody's job to make sure everybody's on the same page. Now, by default, it's the owner of the clinic, but the owner of the clinic can designate somebody in the office to do the job. So it becomes their job to make sure that everybody is following protocols for that office the same way. So then you have one person you can go to and say, this is what I'm seeing wrong. You need to make sure everybody's doing it the same way. One of the places I find troubling is when you have staff that work in multiple offices. They might work in your office 3 days a week, and then they go to another office for 2 days a week. And they come in and they say, well, in this office over here, we do it that way. And it seems so much simpler. I'm going to do it that way here. But it may not meet the guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it comes down to somebody having the authority to say, no, in this office, this is how we do it. Now, I mentioned that office in Ontario that was potentially may have spread hepatitis C to a young boy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, reality is, we don't know whether it happened in that office or not. We just know in that office they weren't doing things correctly. The dentist in that case lost his accreditation. He can't practice in Ontario. But the hygienist and the dental assistants also lost their accreditation because they knew what they were doing was wrong, but they did it anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Infection prevention is everybody's job. Everybody in the office has responsibility. We've all got to be on the same page. And unfortunately, in a lot of dental offices, I'll find 2 or 3 assistants do an amazing job. So 2 or 3 assistants kind of slack off because the other ones will pick up the slack.
It's, I've heard people say, again, that trying to put concern on the doctor, on the owner. I've heard that myself. And people believing that, it's the doctor's insurance that's going to cover them under if there are issues.
Right.
But again, my understanding from outsider looking in, hygienists carry their own insurance, and they have their own accreditation, their own colleges to report to. Dental assistants are the same, as I understand it as well.
Yeah,
but again, so it is a shared responsibility.
absolutely. And it can get confusing. So when the first COVID protocols came out, when offices began to reopen, first it was we can do emergency procedures. Then there was a lot of confusion as to what an emergency procedure was. Then it was, okay, well, hygienists can come back to work, but they can't use a Cavitron. But the dentist could use the Cavitron. So the hygienist could do all the hand scaling, and then the dentist could walk in and use that Cavitron to finish the scaling. It didn't make any sense. So eventually the organizations got together and came up with one set of protocols and cleared everything up. But when COVID happened, there was a ton of confusion out there.
Oh, I remember, and it really did seem like the hygiene colleges were putting in different requirements and regulations than dentistry, and it was kind of like no one was on the same page. It was, and it would, not a situation I would want to be in charge of at all in regards to how to figure it out in a timely manner. But yeah, it definitely seemed like there's breakdowns of communication. And
Absolutely. I remember, I think it was May 14th, Jason Kenney did a press conference and said, yes, dental offices could reopen. And the ADA&C went, what? Shouldn't you have told us first? And they went, no, we can't reopen. We haven't got a written protocol yet. And then 3 days later, the ADA&C said, okay, we're ready. Here's a protocol. But that's where a lot of the confusion came in, is not everybody was speaking to each other. And a lot of it was hearsay and that sort of thing. But it's way better now.
Do you see the things that have been put in place because of COVID being retracted or relaxed once, say, COVID is in our rearview mirror, say vaccinations are taking effect, and we're through this, or is it, now that it's here, is it here to stay?
I'm not quite sure. Now, I did have discussions with the University of Saskatchewan, and they've gone ahead and spent millions of dollars revamping the dental college there. They kicked all the instructors out of their offices and turned their offices into enclosed operatories. So going forward, they plan to do everything in enclosed rooms, no more open concept. Saskatchewan Polytechnic, they do dental hygienist training and dental assistant training in Regina. They're spending $6 million revamping the college there, again, to do those individual operatories. And according to them, going forward, they are going to maintain those protocols. I haven't heard anything in Alberta yet as to what is going forward. And realistically, I can see us going back to the way we were doing things before COVID hit.
Yeah.
Because our protocols should handle all of this.
And in regards to the changing in operatories, like I'm just in my time in this industry, when I first got in, everything was open concept. Center islands, rear cabinets, bowling alleys of operatories. But but before COVID, even there was a slow change that we've seen is more and more offices are going back to closed operatories, just for privacy, just for volume. Again, talking to patients next door and people concerned about what's being heard, and so they wanted a closed operatory. And again, the layout and the equipment and the furniture that's being put in operatories is changing. It's allowing it to, again, be closed but still be in a smaller space and have room. But again, it'll be interesting to see what's going to happen. And I guess the concern is, well, first of all, I think Alberta did reasonable changes in terms of what was asked for because of COVID. So if they did stay, it's again, we're not boarding up and closing in operatories that are open, like Saskatchewan, for example. This is, so if it stays, it's not terrible. But again, it generally sees that when new rules get put in place, whether it's dentistry or medicine or other industries, it's very unlikely that they get retracted. But again, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, and there's a line I have to walk there because my territory is Alberta and Saskatchewan. So with Saskatchewan making that decision, it'll be interesting to see the ramifications to the dental offices, because most of those offices put in temporary partitions for now so they could get back up and running. If they get mandated they have to have isolation rooms, that's going to be a huge cost for them to retrofit. And I personally don't think it's necessary. I think that we have other methods of dealing with those aerosols. If we had to add in extra filtration systems, that's a much lower cost than whatnot. The idea of the isolation rooms, I agree. I would much rather be in an enclosed room so I don't have to hear what's going on in the operatory next to me. the whole idea of the open concept was to reduce the cost of building those clinics as well. So we could share x-ray heads from one side to the other, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But when you read the actual construction guidelines for doing those open concepts, we were supposed to have adequate air exchange systems going on. And according to the construction guidelines, we were supposed to be turning the air over in those operatories every hour and a half anyways. But nobody ever worked that into the construction, and nobody ever mandated it. So it sort of fell by the wayside. Now what I can see going forward is when we are building dental clinics, we're going to be thinking about that air exchange rate in those operatories going forward. And we're going to be putting in HVAC systems that are going to turn that over faster. And we might put in air filtration systems in the central system rather than in the operatory, that sort of thing.
Oh, yeah, and we're seeing those companies come online. We're seeing those companies merge from other industries, whether it's in mostly industrial industries coming into dental and medical for that very reason. And yeah, and some have systems that are just basically plug into the wall. It sits in the corner of the room. Others are mounted on walls or in ceilings. And again, there are some systems too that are fully vented and have their own venting that would be very difficult to retrofit. But again, on a fresh build could very easily be installed and do just that. Hey, Ted, is there anything we haven't touched on today that you wanted to kind of to discuss or put light on?
Well, one of the things that always comes up is offices are very concerned about the cost of doing things correctly. The cost of the pouches, the cost of the indicator tests. And yeah, that is going up, but it's a very, 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 very small percentage of the sundry purchases. Mm-hmm. So overall, it's not going to make or break a practice doing things correctly. And in fact, if we look at a business analysis and look at ways that we can streamline systems, free people up to be doing other things, doing analysis, are we better off buying bulk burrs compared to pre-sterilized burrs? What are we doing? We can look at systems that can actually save them money and work that out. And that's where you're really good, is going into those offices and helping them do that business analysis and looking at, how can we streamline things? How can we save you money? And how can we make this more efficient? And that's the key, is efficiency. The systems in place, once they get in place and are followed by everybody, they are very efficient and they're very cost efficient that way.
And never trying to preach on fear, but like, again, also it's much cheaper to do it right the first way as opposed to have to deal with the repercussions of something not going as planned.
Yeah. So, for example, an office that has been shut down by public health, their name got out into the public. They lost 80% of their clientele, and almost 3 years later, they haven't recovered from that. That's, a bad public health office could be an office killer. Mm-hmm. But public health offices are rare, and usually based on complaints. And for the vast majority of dental offices I go into, they're not going to have any issues whatsoever with a public health audit.
As long as they've done the work up front to kind of have that policy in place, have those people identified as the leaders in the clinic.
Exactly. And as long as public health can see that there is an attempt being made to do the best that you can with what you have.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing to keep in mind is equipment doesn't last forever, right? Eventually, these things wear out. And one of the big things that I see is hand pieces that are, the knurling is all worn off and they're brown and beat up. If you went to a restaurant and they handed you a fork where the electroplating was all worn off of it, would you think you're eating in a good restaurant? But yet we sit these patients down and hang what looks like a worn out handpiece in front of them. Or we put a burr block, an aluminum burr block that's supposed to be blue, and it's all silver and scratched and gouged, and it's beyond its useful life. We have to think about that impression that we're giving to the patients as well. We have to almost do a little song and dance. They have to see us hand sanitize. They have to see us put on the gloves. They have to see us open up those instruments out of those pouches so that they feel comfortable that what we're using on them is clean and sterile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just to touch on what you're saying too, is like everything has a lifespan too, but the lifespan isn't necessarily measured in years. It's more likely measured in cycles or uses or procedures, where again, what in one practice buys a sterilizer for that matter, and it's a slower practice. It's starting up. It's low patient base. That sterilizer could last quite a few years, but the practice down the street that's established possibly should be buying 2 or 3 sterilizers, and is using it multiple times a day, that again, just based on cycles, that sterilizer is not going to last.
Well, and we also have to look at redundancies.
Yeah.
Whenever you're designing a dental practice, you're putting in a 2-head suction system and a 2-head compressor. In case one goes down, at least you have suction and air so that you can still do procedures. It's the same with reprocessing.
Yeah.
If you're putting in an instrument washer, maybe we need to look at putting in 2 smaller ones as opposed to 1 big one, so you have redundancy. Or maybe we have to keep that ultrasonic in the back room in case there's a problem with the instrument washer, that we can pull that back out and go back to hand scrubbing and ultrasonicing, so we keep the practice open. And no practice should be practicing with just one sterilizer, because if you don't have sterile instruments, how do you keep working? And it is not the dealer's responsibility to have loaners for those dental practices. They should have redundancy built into the practice.
Yeah, what's the cost of losing a day? Hey, Ted, you do go into a lot of offices and you do help them with education. Now, I'm going to include your cell phone, your email in the show notes for people to reach out to you. And I guess, is that the best way to just give you a call, shoot you a text, email?
Give me a call, send me a text, send me an email. I'm available way too often than I should be, according to my wife. I don't limit my work hours. I'm happy to answer any questions on infection prevention and control. Of course, I'm always there to answer questions on Sci-Can product, but most of my time is doing exactly this, infection prevention and control training.
Well, and yeah, that's exactly why I wanted to have you on and have this conversation today. So, hey, Ted, thanks so much for doing this. And again, I'll include your contacts. And hey, maybe we can get together and do this again and just carry on the conversation.
Thanks, Bob. I really appreciate it.
All right. Okay, talk to you soon. Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Bye for now.